Hey, it's Professor Gould. In this chapter, we're going to start talking about the molecules that are important for life, the most important categories of molecules. And we're going to start with the first group, which are carbohydrates. Carbs, everybody's favorite. Now, to clarify, all carbohydrates are sugars and all sugars are carbohydrates. Now, not all of them are processed as sugar or used for energy in your body. We will talk about that more later. But anything that is a carbohydrate is a sugar. Sugar is just carbs. Okay, so all carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen and nothing else. And they all have the same chemical ratio. However many carbons there are, there's the same number of oxygens, twice that many hydrogens. So CnH2nOn. So for example, glucose is a 6-carbon sugar. So as you can see on the license plate of this Nissan Cube, that would be C6H12O6. So N2N, which means that this is a sugar cube. Okay. There are 3 categories of carbohydrates, and they're distinguished by how big they are. Monosaccharides are a single simple sugar, one sugar molecule. When we take 2 sugar molecules and connect them with a chemical bond, we make a disaccharide. Di means 1. So monosaccharide 1, disaccharide 2. If you get more than 2, we call that a polysaccharide. Many monosaccharides. It could just be 3, but generally speaking, polysaccharides are often very, very big. It could be 3,000. Almost all simple sugars are isomers, meaning that they have the same chemical formula, C6H12O6, but they're shaped differently. Now, in the last chapter, we talked about isotopes, which are the same element with different numbers of neutrons. In this chapter, we're talking about isomers. Now, iso means the same. So these are the same chemical formula, but different placement of the functional groups, which makes them act differently. So even though these have the same chemical formula, functionally, they're going to be very, very different. So here we have glucose and fructose, same formula, C6H12O6, but here the location of this C double bond O and the location of whether it is before or after this OH, this hydroxide functional group, it doesn't look like that would make a difference, and we really can't go into it from an OChem point of view why it makes such a big difference. It makes a huge difference in how these molecules bind to other molecules. So you may have heard, oh, glucose and fructose are chemically the same. That means they have the same chemical formula. They are chemically, as in the formula, the same. They are physically and functionally very different. Now, glucose is the most important monosaccharide in biology. Your cells are going to use, almost all of your cells, use glucose to make another molecule called ATP. They're going to harvest the energy in these chemical bonds in the glucose molecule to make another molecule which your cells actually use for energy. Glucose is also the most common sugar that plants make by photosynthesis, which is where we get most of our glucose. We get it from plants. It's a 6-carbon sugar, so C6H12O6, and it can be shown either straight in a line or more commonly in a ring like that. Now, glucose is used for energy in the human body. Other sugars have to be turned into glucose before they can be used, which is a problem with fructose. Now, we evolved to eat sugars from fruits and vegetables, and those sugars are essentially sucrose, almost entirely, which is 1 glucose and 1 fructose bound together with a chemical bond. So it's 50-50 glucose and fructose. But now we figured out how to make in a lab high fructose corn syrup, which is at least 55% fructose, 45% glucose, sometimes higher fructose. We now have, extra high fructose corn syrup? The problem is that your physiology evolved with 50-50 glucose fructose. So when you take in a glucose molecule, your body is expecting there to be one fructose along with it. When you eat high fructose corn syrup, you get one glucose and more than one fructose. But your brain doesn't know that you got extra fructose. Your bloodstream doesn't know. And your pancreas, which produces insulin, doesn't know. So it mismeasures how much food you've taken in. This is particularly important in the brain because fructose doesn't turn on your brain receptors for fullness. It literally doesn't tell you you're full. So if your brain is expecting that half of the sugar is glucose, but it's actually less than half, then your brain thinks that you've eaten less sugar than you actually have. And that's one of the things that's bad about high fructose corn syrup is that it tricks your brain into thinking that you haven't taken in as much sugar as you have and messes up the signals between the taste buds and the brain. So the intestines are expecting a certain amount of sugar and not getting it. It's really complicated, but we know that it is linked, the increased use of high fructose corn syrup is linked to several other health problems, including the increase in diabetes in our country. This may be one of the reasons. Let's talk about another disaccharide, which is lactose, which of course is the sugar, the primary sugar in milk. This is a disaccharide of glucose and galactose, and it is formed by a dehydration reaction. Now, dehydration is without water, right, or taking out water. Dehydration reaction literally removes water during the reaction. So we take an OH from one molecule, an H from the other, use the remaining O to connect the two sugar monomers, and we get a lactose molecule plus a water molecule. How do we reverse this? We add a water back in, break the water into an OH and an H. Now, polysaccharides require a bunch of those dehydration reactions in order to link many, many monomers of sugar. In this case, all of these are monomers of glucose, and the only difference between them is the shape of the molecule, whether it's branched or not, and the type of connection between the glucose monomers. Starch is made by plants. It's very easy for our bodies to break down into glucose monomers, simple sugars. Glycogen is made by muscle fibers, muscle in your body, and the liver to store glucose when you have extra glucose in your blood. And then also is broken down very, very quickly to release glucose in the blood when your blood sugar is low. Cellulose is made by plants, and we actually can't disconnect or break the bonds between these cellulose fibers. But cellulose makes plants very, very strong. It creates cell walls in plants, and we'll come back to that when we do cells. It's the stuff that makes plants stand up. Trees are primarily cellulose. Plants use starch not to feed us. They create these pockets of starch like potatoes in order to store energy so that during times when the plant is not actively doing photosynthesis, it can still survive on the energy that it has stored away as starch. Cellulose helps plants stand up. It's what they use to make physical structures for themselves. And then another polysaccharide is called chitin, and this is the stuff that makes the exoskeleton of insects and crabs and lobsters, all arthropods, which is a phylum, group of exoskeleton animals. They all have an exoskeleton made out of this polysaccharide. Now, these two polysaccharides we can't break down. Cellulose is the most abundant organic compound. It's every plant. Now, why can't we break it down? How is that a thing? Well, it turns out not only can you not eat wood, no animal can eat wood. Now, for those of you who are paying attention, this sounds wackadoodle crazy. Because, hello, termites, all they do is eat wood. How do they not survive on wood? Here's the thing. A termite doesn't break down the cellulose. The termite has protists inside its guts that break down the cellulose for them. How cool is that? All right, so the difference between cellulose and starch is the shape of this bond between the two glucose molecules. They're both polymers of glucose. The only difference is the shape of the bond. One of these, the one in starch, we can break down. The one in cellulose and in chitin, we can't break down. This, then, cellulose, becomes what we call dietary fiber. And even though it's indigestible by your intestines, it is very, very important for your health because our intestines evolved on a diet high in fiber. And they depend on that bulk of plant tissue moving through the intestines to keep the intestines healthy. You also have bacteria in your gut that can digest some of the cellulose. And those bacteria actually help to keep you healthy. So you need fiber in your diet to keep your intestines healthy and also to keep your bacteria in your gut healthy, which also keeps you healthy. Eat whole fruits and vegetables so that you get enough fiber in your diet. Don't eat smoothies. That is not going to get you fiber because it's already chopped up a bunch of these molecules. All right, remember we talked about polymers in the last chapter? Remember that polymers are large molecules made up of monomers. Starch, cellulose, chitin, and glycogen are all polymers of glucose monomers. Here's the glucose monomer. That is a monosaccharide when it's by itself. Put two of them together, you get a disaccharide. Put more than two together, you get a polysaccharide. In this case, a polysaccharide is a polymer, but there are other polymers, some of which we will talk about in the next section.